So in this chapter, obviously, we'll be looking at World War I, or more specifically, to put a finer point on that, not really so much, or I'd argue not quite so much World War I by itself on its own, but the United States' involvement in World War I, how the United States contributes to the conflict, and of course the results of it, particularly in regard to the United States' role in trying to hammer out those results, and how it all affects the United States. So we won't be looking quite so much at why the war broke out and the different complexities of the fighting and the military things, but I know it's a little disappointing for a lot of you. But more about, like I said, the United States' role in it, which the United States doesn't even take, in the grand scheme of things, the United States' military role in World War I doesn't even happen until about the final year. So we'll be looking at that part of it next week. Today we're going to talk about the different factors that lead the United States to get involved in this conflict, how the United States gets from, neutrality, a precedent that had been set way, way, way before this conflict, to being involved in the war, and then how the United States goes about preparing for the task of being involved in the war. And the title of the chapter here, The War to End War, as you probably recall from world history, a lot of people referred to, at the time and in the years immediately following, referred to this conflict as the war to end all war. That this would be like the last war ever fought on Earth. This would be the last actual war like this that humankind experiences. Just from your prior knowledge of World War I, why do you think people called it that? What did they mean, and why did they think that this was the war to end it all, end all wars? What was the only memory was unique and particularly horrifying about this war? Yeah.
So many huge national powers participated in it.
Yeah, you have so many big, this is like, the biggest empires on Earth that were involved in it. Britain and France and the Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary, all, pretty much all of Europe, it seemed, involved in this. What else was different about this war, or what had changed about this war that made it all the more horrifying? Yes?
Didn't they use chemical warfare?
Yeah, it's the first time you see a lot of, an industrialized war. This is the first war like this, of this size, of this magnitude, in this more industrialized age, in which there is what we would call chemical warfare, mustard gas or poison gas, machine guns, all these things that just made the carnage indescribable and incomprehensible. And so people just didn't understand and really thought, felt like this was, this kind of fighting, this kind of a war just could not be withstood by human beings anymore. So let's again kind of, the United States is kind of numb to that at first and is very shocked and horrified by all that, watching this, massive German advance right there at the beginning. And then after that advance, if you recall from world history, I know it's been several years now, then it just becomes that stalemate for so long where, armies are just fighting and fighting and fighting, and the casualties are terrible, and destruction, beautiful countrysides and landscapes of Europe just being reduced to just total wastelands for months at a time, and nothing happening. Those battles going on for some of them, I think, even over a year, and just casualties mounting up. And of course, Americans were incredibly horrified by that and quite relieved that the United States wasn't involved in such a thing, and being further and further committed to that idea of neutrality, one that was, like we've already said, a precedent that had been, around since the Washington administration. Why would it change now? But certainly when Americans see the destruction and the carnage that's taking place in Europe, they're all the more glad for that neutrality. But as we know, that neutrality was difficult to maintain. So what we talked about earlier this week, the United States is attempting to remain neutral, and that would mean in this case trading with both countries. But the United States was mostly trading with Britain, with the Allies, Britain and France and their allies. Why were they not really trading with Germany?
The British had a blockade that was blocking the Germans from getting American ships.
That's right. So because of the blockade, that is why the United States wasn't trading with Germany. And so what did Germany start doing that starts upsetting the United States?
They started attacking their ships.
Attacking merchant ships. So there has been this attacking of merchant ships, of neutral ships, including American ships, or including ships that at least had Americans aboard, by the Germans throughout the war. And that had been a source of contention for a couple of years. And Wilson had multiple times, made demands of the German government to stop sinking neutral ships, or to at least have warning before neutral ships were sunk. And where we left this was with that Sussex Pledge, which that's what your bell ringer was now that I think about it. The Sussex Pledge, what did Germany promise in that Sussex Pledge, Stacia?
They had a promise that they wouldn't attack neutral ships without warning.
Right, so that's what we've left at about 1916 or so, is Germany has said we won't sink any more neutral ships without warning. But as you can probably guess, they don't keep that promise forever. That promise is kept for a couple of months, close to a year, until January of 1917, when Germany announces unrestricted warfare on the Atlantic. What does unrestricted mean?
They won't hold back, like we'll do it without warning.
Yeah, they're not holding back anymore. Basically, they're breaking the Sussex Pledge and saying there are no restrictions. Everybody's a target, neutral ships included, and you may or may not get a warning. We cannot promise that anymore. By this point, Germany wants to end the war. It's been going on way longer than a lot of them would have thought. They want to end the fight, and so they want to break that British blockade. And by this point, they are willing to risk war with the United States in order to do that. One of the reasons they had negotiated things like the Sussex Pledge and had been somewhat willing to try to at least listen to the United States' demands, because they didn't want the United States to get in on the war. They didn't want another enemy to have to fight, and they certainly didn't want help coming in on the side of Britain and France, reinforcements and such. But by the time we get to 1917, they're kind of more willing to do that at this point. They're getting a little bit more desperate. So in January of 1917, Germany basically says all bets are off. We can't make those promises anymore. So people may get a warning, they may not. You need to tell your folks that if they travel across the Atlantic, they travel anywhere near the British Isles, those kind of things are a possibility. And so that already has angered the United States, and it is leading President Wilson to prepare to break diplomatic relationships with Germany over that unrestricted submarine warfare. And breaking diplomatic relations, what are diplomatic relations, by the way? If you have diplomatic relations with a country, what does that mean?
You're on good terms.
Well, and it may even you might even have bad terms, but it means you're talking. If you have diplomatic relationships, we have diplomatic relations with countries that we don't like very much, but there is communication going on. We recognize that government is legitimate. There is some kind of exchange happening. If you break diplomatic relations, it basically means we're not talking anymore. So think about like a fight between two friends. Maybe they're angry with each other, but they're still speaking, and then it might get to a point where they're not speaking anymore. That's kind of breaking diplomatic relations, and that is usually almost always a precursor to war. That's like the last thing. Now, to further make Americans angry, that kind of adds to the submarine warfare is still a very big part of it. But what further makes Americans extremely outraged, particularly the public, really shifts public opinion even further against Germany if it wasn't there enough. Something called the Zimmerman Telegram, which gets leaked to, I suppose, and printed in American newspapers. The Zimmerman Telegram, this was a message. It was to the Mexican government. It's a message to the Mexican government from Arthur Zimmerman, who was a German official. He was like a German, I think he was an ambassador, but a German official to Mexico, or the German ambassador to Mexico. And this was a message that he sent to the Mexican government that ends up somehow getting intercepted, by the United States and then printed in American newspapers. And in this Zimmerman Telegram, it suggests, it doesn't order, and it's kind of a little vague, but it's all, you'll read it, you'll a little bit later, and you'll see. It doesn't quite order them to do it or anything, but it does perhaps suggest that Mexico attack the United States, that Mexico get involved in this conflict by attacking the United States, kind of suggesting that they do that. And it also suggests that as well as attacking the United States, or rather, that if they attack the United States, that Germany will assist, that Germany will help. and specifically that they will help Mexico gain back territory that they have lost from the United States. And what territory had Mexico lost from the United States? Texas, California, Arizona, Nevada, all that under that Mexican cession from the Mexican War. They suggest or hint at that you attack the United States, we'll help you out, we'll be a part of that, and we will help you gain back all those territories and your honor and all those kind of things that that you lost from the United States. So that's the Zimmerman telegram that gets, again, fed to American newspapers and gets published in American newspapers. So now, in addition to reading about unrestricted warfare and being warned not to travel to Europe and don't travel anywhere near the British Isles, and you've already seen multiple ships like the Lusitania and others be sunk and several Americans being killed, cargoes being seized, and now you have this, Germany's telling Mexico to attack us and all this stuff. So you can see how that would outrage Americans significantly, how this would make a lot of Americans say that Germany was a threat and the United States needed to protect itself, and the United States needed to defend itself. So it certainly doesn't, and Mexico doesn't do any of those things or take any action. There's no telling, exactly how serious the Zimmerman telegram was taken at the time, but it certainly does a great deal to shift American public opinion and to, push more people in favor of perhaps going to war or feeling like war might be necessary to defend themselves from German advances. Another event that takes place around this time that is going to have eventually some sort of effect on all of this, although this one is a little bit more slowly evolving, and this also changes the situation in a number of ways. It's going to change American perspective on things, and it's also just going to change the war eventually. And that it begins in March of 1917 when the Russian Revolution begins. Once again, rehashing world history. Russia was involved in the war, in World War I. 1917 is when their revolution begins, where essentially the Tsar, the monarchy in Russia, is overthrown. And at first, and this is kind of an evolving thing, and it's complex. The Russian Revolution is a very complex situation. You can study it forever and ever. At first, some Americans found this perhaps pretty exciting, and maybe exciting is too strong of a word, but encouraging, and might have been kind of pleased with that. I've heard it said that, if any country needed a revolution at this point, Russia was probably one of them. Russia was a monarchy. It was a very, it was not a constitutional monarchy. It was a monarchy that ruled with an iron fist. I mean, the Tsar was kind of like a dictator. That kind of government often made the United States quite nervous. It was not consistent at all with the United States' government. And the fact that they were allied with Britain and France, that had always been a little bit, a little uncomfortable in that, you had this, these two sort of democracies of Europe paired up with this total not democracy of Europe. It was sort of like, oh, we really got to support them. And when the Russian Revolution first began, at first, a democratic government seemed to be where they were going. It seemed to be like they were heading toward democracy. And they were advocates for more democracy in Russia, overthrowing the Tsar. They were advocates for a republican government that was more similar to that of the United States, that was more similar to Britain. So a lot of Americans at first might have found this, pretty encouraging that maybe Russia was finally going in that direction. But as some of you probably remember from world history, that whole attempt at democracy did not last very long in Russia. What eventually happens? Eventually you get the communists take over and it becomes the Soviet Union and all that kind of stuff. Now that doesn't happen for a couple more months. But that, it does kind of change, and by the time that all happens, the United States is already in the war anyway, so it kind of, like I said, it's sort of an evolving thing. It kind of becomes more of a factor a little bit later on. But for one thing this will eventually mean is that it means Russia is going to drop out of the war. It means Russia will quit World War I. Again, that happens several months from this. This is just when it starts. But the Russian Revolution eventually does mean that Russia is out of the war. That means Britain and France have lost one of their allies. And what does it mean for Germany if Russia quits?
It's one less enemy to beat.
One less enemy to fight, so there becomes a greater sense of urgency amongst Americans because of this. Again, not immediately, all this takes several months to play out. But this later contributes to a much greater sense of urgency amongst the United States and concern that if Russia's not in it anymore, that means Britain and France are far more vulnerable, and the United States might need to be involved in order to ensure their survival and their success. Because this makes things easier for Germany now. They don't have to fight a two-front war anymore. They don't have enemies on either sides of them. And, the British and the French can't rely on that anymore, so they might need that assistance. Again, Russia's not going to drop out of the war immediately, but it also creates kind of an ideological thing as well, which I'll get back to that in just a moment. So this kind of is going to further complicate the issue. And again, it is really something that kind of more affects it later on because the outcome of the Russian Revolution is very uncertain for quite some time. But all of this eventually leads to, in April of 1917, President Wilson feels that the United States, in order to protect itself and protect its honor, really more than anything, I asked Congress for a declaration of war. So officially April, I think the 6th. Specific date doesn't really matter, but April of 1917, Congress votes to declare war. It is not totally unanimous. There were people opposed to the Senate opposed to the war, but war is declared, and the United States enters, of course, on the side of the Allies with Britain and France, and at the time, Russia is still in it. Now, this quote here, this comes from President Wilson's address to Congress when he asks for the declaration of war, and this phrase becomes a very sort of fundamental idea for Wilson about why the war is being fought, about what it's really all about, and particularly why the United States has to be involved in it. He says this is about making sure the world is made safe for democracy, that the world must be made safe for democracy. What do you think that means when he says the world must be made safe for democracy?
The German monarchy takes over all of Europe, there's no more room for democracy in Europe, which means Europe's much more powerful monarchy.
Right. He's saying this is not just about who gets to rule over what piece of land. This is not about who gets to, have the biggest army and stuff. This is about making sure democracy itself survives. This is about attacking not just Germany and not just Austria-Hungary or any of those. It's about attacking the very idea of dictatorship and autocracy and those kind of things. This is about making sure that democracy can thrive in the world. And so therefore we, the United States, as a great democracy, must join with other democracies of the world, Britain and France, and sort of kind of Russia, but not really, soon not to be. See how that gets a little complicated. And fight against these anti-democratic countries, fight against those old world ideas where you have dictators and that kind of thing. And this is about setting that example and making sure that democracy can spread throughout the world. Remember that we've already talked about, Wilson is a super idealist. This is his idealism through and through. We've already talked about that in reference to self-determination and anti-imperialism. He didn't see that as consistent with democracy. So again, he sees that as the real reason why the United States has to get involved here. It is about honor, defending our honor, defending America's democracy, but also making sure that democracy spreads throughout the world. And if countries like Germany and stuff are running everything, then it can't. It's about kind of bringing converts into the fold, as it were, for democracy. So the United States declares war April of 1917, again with this very high-minded, very idealistic attitude with it. And Wilson will constantly and always champion those ideas, and that will be stuff that he will try to, will come back in when we look at the end of the war, that Wilson's idealism and his thoughts on making the world a safe place for democracy and making sure that democracy grows and expands, and we see the end of those old dictatorships and those old empires and all that kind of stuff, that will really play a big part in negotiating peace. And we'll see how Wilson has a lot of difficulties with that, and how he kind of stands alone in a lot of ways in that sense. So now we want to take a look at mobilization for the war. Because even though all this mess had been going on for Europe for a couple of years prior to the United States' involvement, and it seems clear to us that the United States was kind of headed in that direction for quite some time, there really was little preparation at all that had been done in case the United States ended up in the war. Maybe a little bit, but for the most part, when the United States declares war, it is certainly not at all in a place where it's ready to start fighting. And so there is a massive undertaking by the United States government to prepare the United States for war, to get the United States in a place where we could produce the soldiers, the food, the ammunition, all of those things. You would think, again, well, the United States has been supplying the Allies for a couple of years, we'd be ready to, fight ourselves, but that's really not at all the case. At this point in time, the military was still quite small. The Navy was still very, very underdeveloped. So there's a big challenge of mobilization, including military mobilization, but also economic mobilization. What does that mean, mobilization, to get mobilized? Get ready, get things moving. And that's quite a challenge. And it's what we'll see here is a massive undertaking by the federal government and by state governments even to get things ready. It's a massive expansion of federal authority. We're going to see the federal government take on a big role here and, kind of forcing, perhaps force is too strong of a word, but really administering, maybe that's a better word, administering and organizing the economy, saying, here's what we need to do. We're going to produce this. We're not going to produce that, so forth and so on. But in a very, not exactly ordering it, but kind of trying to organize so that industry will be able to do those kind of things on their own. So all the things we're about to talk about here are part of this economic mobilization, getting production where it needs to be, getting supplies where they need to be, all that sort of stuff. And again, all of this that we're about to list, or I'm about to list, is part of economic mobilization. The thing is, when we think about getting the country ready, we're probably thinking about the government like ordering factories to produce this or telling people not to do that. We will see that later on in the 20th century, particularly in the Second World War. But in the First World War, the United States government, while they did a massive amount of work and spent a massive amount of money, and there is a massive expansion of federal power to bring about this mobilization, they also tried to do it almost entirely by voluntary means, trying to get citizens and businesses to voluntarily do A, B, or C in order to get mobilized and ready for a fight. And this is also happening, in the midst of the progressive movement as well. So I don't think that the two things have, one has ended and the new one is beginning. So one government agency, there were lots of new government agencies that were created, regulatory agencies and others during the war to try to bring about that mobilization or to perform some kind of job, to do some kind of task. Again, it's a very big expansion of the federal government. There are all kinds of new agencies that are created. There are probably about 500,000 federal jobs that are created during World War I for the purpose of staffing and working with these federal agencies. So we're just going to mention a few of them. Some of the big ones include things like the Food Administration. What do you think the Food Administration was supposed to do?
Make sure that the Army had something to eat.
Yeah, make sure the Army's got something to eat. This is about conserving food, and they don't want to ration, so we don't want to do that. They're trying to get people to do it voluntarily. So they're basically launching campaigns to encourage Americans to save food, to be more economical with their food, to, only eat these things, not those things, limit what you buy, limit what you're using, so that we can make sure we send enough to feed our soldiers and to feed other allies that we are trying to support. So they are trying to increase agricultural production, trying to get farmers to produce more, trying to get people to waste less, and trying to encourage people overall to, again, think about the war effort when they think about what they're going to eat and how they will get their food. All through posters and slogans and pictures and things like that. So encouraging people, like this one, be patriotic. All this kind of stuff about this is patriotic. Love your country. Show your love for your country. Help us win the war. Their phrase, food will win the war, all around the country. Encouraging people to eat, again, certain kinds of foods, to avoid like wheat-based things. They could send wheat and flour and bread to the troops. You have these campaigns encouraging people to have Meatless Tuesday. That was a popular one. Have Meatless Tuesday once a week. Don't eat meat in your house, just have vegetables. To have another one, something like Porkless Sunday or something like that. And there's a few other ones, posters and things like that, encouraging people to save food. Victory gardens were a big part of this. You may have heard of victory gardens before, or victory gardens.
So instead of going and buying produce at the grocery store, they encourage people to grow their own things in their own backyard.
Yeah, so encouraging people to grow their own food. People in the cities even have a victory garden. Why do they call it a victory garden?
Help us win the
This
war.
will help us win. So growing their own vegetables, even if they're in the city and that kind of stuff, getting people to conserve food. And this is usually successful. The overall agricultural output expands. I mean, it's something like more than 200% or something that agricultural exports and production expands. Waste is reduced. So the Food Administration was quite successful in getting people to, by voluntary means, conserve what they were eating, only eat certain things, and try to conserve things for the army without rationing, without saying people cannot have or can only have so much of particular foods or things like that. The Fuel Administration pretty much does the exact same thing, except in relation to what? In relation to fuel, which at this time would have most of the things like kerosene or other kinds of oil, not quite so much gasoline. Cars have been invented by this point, but they're not real widespread. So most of the fuel that people would have used in their homes would have probably been stuff like kerosene for kerosene lamps, or other kinds of oil for oil lamps and stuff like that. Perhaps for farm equipment, those kind of things. So not quite as much gasoline, although there was some of it. But once again, same idea, encouraging people to use less of that stuff with posters, with slogans. There's something like, what is it, Heatless Sunday, or I can't remember what day of the week it is, but encouraging people, have a day of the week where you don't turn on your heater, your kerosene heaters and stuff, or have an evening, 1 or 2 evenings a week where you don't turn on your lamps and things like that, which most of these, a lot of people have electricity in their house, but not everybody. Encouraging people to conserve those things so they could be used for the war effort, and that was quite successful as well. Now, there's also, attempts by the government to make sure that certain things were being produced, that there was enough being produced of them, so forth and so on. So there was a government agency created, which it's not incredibly powerful, but the idea of it is significant enough, called the War Industries Board. They, again, aren't allocated with, it sounds like they ought to be really powerful. They're not quite as powerful as the version of this that we'll see in the Second World War. But the War Industries Board had the authority to allocate raw materials, to say, okay, well, this factory over here, since you're making munitions and you're making tanks and that kind of stuff, you need this steel. And this company over here, you're not making any of that stuff, so you're going to have to do it less for now. They had the authority to do those kind of things. So government intervention to allocate raw materials. They could order new plants to be built. We need another factory to build more machine guns, so we're going to open up this one, or we're going to convert that one. They don't end up doing a ton of that during the First World War, using that kind of power. They can even fix prices and dictate prices. So it's not quite as powerful as it kind of sounds from that description, but it did have that authority. It did utilize it some. So again, putting more government control over not just the economy, but specifically production, about what gets produced and how much, something that you really wouldn't expect to see in a free market system like the United States. And none of these things last beyond the war. They're all temporary. And once the war is over, you won't see that kind of stuff anymore. Financing the war is a challenge. A lot of that is done through bonds, buying war bonds. We've talked about bonds before. We've seen these used in previous wars. Just like a savings bond today, you buy this bond, and it's basically like loaning the government your money. And then after a certain amount of time, you get that money back, plus interest. In World War I, they called those Liberty bonds. Why do you think they called them Liberty bonds?
Help keep our country ahead in the war.
Help us keep us ahead in the war. This is about preserving liberty. It's about preserving democracy. Everything really takes on an extremely patriotic character, an extremely patriotic flair to say it's patriotic to buy Liberty bonds, it's patriotic to save your food, it's patriotic to not burn your gas lamps one night a week, all those kind of things. Very much encouraging people to, on their own, support the war effort. So these are just a couple more examples of some of these kind of things. So all kind of advertising, propaganda, and stuff to encourage people. And these are just some of hundreds. Here's one encouraging people to grow their own vegetables. See the lady there with the flag dress, sowing the seeds of victory. This is one about conserving coal. That's the fuel administration. Encouraging people to eat less wheat, less meat, less sugar. Save those for the allies. Eat this other stuff here. Eat your, what does it say there? Your poultry fruits. I guess they don't want fruit in the army. Baked and boiled and broiled foods. Liberty bonds. You can buy, helps them win the war. All those kind of things, encouraging people that they needed to do this stuff in order to make the war successful. So now let's talk about, we looked at, okay, we have the War Industries Board that can set prices and they can allocate materials and all those things. What about the people actually working in the factories? And World War I is going to provide some interesting opportunities for a lot of people, a lot of workers, a lot of labor, because there was great concern. We know we've seen over the past several years a lot of potential conflict between workers in factories and unions and their employers, and there was a great concern amongst many people on both sides of that equation that any kind of labor disputes, any kind of labor unrest, any kind of, certainly any violence, or even just a strike, that could be extremely damaging. We don't want production to slow down. We don't want there to be problems that are going to keep, production from being successful. So during World War I, the United States government creates an organization. Again, there's lots of these new organizations and regulatory agencies that are created during the war. This one is the National Labor Relations Board. And their job was to resolve or mediate, prevent in some way any labor disputes. Like I said, we don't want labor disputes getting in the way of production. We don't want a strike holding up the production of the tanks and the guns and all that kind of stuff. We don't need that right now. So the National Labor Relations Board was trying to encourage both the employers and employees, the workers and the employers, the strikers and the people they're striking against or what have you, to encourage them to try to work things out, basically. And they would mediate labor disputes, oftentimes forcing management to negotiate when probably they wouldn't have before, because again, they don't want the people going on strike and then holding production up and all that kind of thing. So because of that, do you think that workers are going to gain some things? Yeah, they do. Yeah, so their workers' pay, wages are going to go up during World War I significantly, because again, many employers kind of really didn't have too much of a choice. Either they're being pressured by the National Labor Relations Board, or they also didn't want everything to end up in a strike or something like that. So they were pressured to raise wages. Some of them do get 8-hour work days and some other things like that. So a lot of advancements for labor here. Labor unions are very strong during World War I. Labor unions like the AFL, remember the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, experiences a big growth in membership during the war. And a lot of unions were in favor of the war. Some of them weren't. But a lot of labor unions were in favor of the war. And realized that this kind of gave them an edge. It gave them that leverage, to say, we want A, B, and C or we're not going to work. And so they did use that to their advantage. As we will see, though, a lot of this will be short-lived. That once the war is over and they don't have that leverage anymore, we'll see wages go back down. We'll see labor disputes happen again. And some of that stuff will be retracted. But during the war, they did make a lot of advancements. In fact, there are great shortages for labor, as you can probably imagine, because there's lots of people, lots of soldiers that are going off to Europe to fight, and so that meant shortages. And they certainly didn't want shortages of labor, and so a lot of companies, a lot of industries were actively recruiting other employees while others are going off to fight overseas. And that contributes to something known as the Great Migration, which you read about in the previous chapter. What is this migration? What kind of people, which groups of people were migrating and where were they migrating to? Right, this largely refers to African Americans migrating from the south to the north. So there was a big effort by a lot of industries to recruit employees when there were so many people being displaced because of the war or leaving because of the war. And so they actively recruited a lot of particularly southern farmers that were underemployed, say, here's an opportunity for you. And so we start to see during the World War I years, and this continues for many decades after, thousands upon thousands of African Americans moving to northern cities for those job opportunities, whether they were in railroad yards or in steel mills and different things like that. This results in African American populations in a lot of northern cities like Detroit and Chicago and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, more than doubling in some places. And so it completely changes the racial dynamic and the cultural dynamic of a lot of northern cities. And unfortunately, that leads to a lot of problems, in some cases violence and such. We'll look early in the 1920s, this does lead to resistance and violence and race riots in a lot of northern cities, as unfortunately, many of those people were not welcomed into those cities, even in the north. And again, that's a trend that continues of people moving out of the south to the north for those employment opportunities, other economic opportunities. Now, many of those jobs were also being filled by women. So women in World War I, first of all, and I think I'll mention this again later, many women are participating. World War I is actually the first time that women are allowed to enlist in the Army. They don't fight in combat, but they are allowed to enlist. So there are plenty of women being involved that way. And for many women, they were involved in the traditional kind of ways, gathering supplies, encouraging the buying of Liberty bonds and that kind of stuff. But many women, of course, go to work because of this. Many women going to, because there were shortages for labor, there were industries that were recruiting people to work, and so a lot of them are going to work in the factory, building the munitions, building the tanks, all those kind of things. And that's true of white women, and it's true of African American women. Lots of women finding employment during World War I. Now, of course, as you probably know, all this is all short-lived, and this will see the same thing happen in the Second World War. So once the war is over, we will see most of those women return to most likely the home and places like that. They won't stay in those kind of industries and jobs. However, women's participation in the war effort, both military and non-military, does eventually lead more people, including President Wilson, to finally embrace women's suffrage. And while women's suffrage, if you're talking about Wilson in particular, while that was something that Wilson had not wanted to support, because of women's involvement in World War I, their contribution to the victory, as it were, that does lead even President Wilson to finally support women's suffrage. And so it is kind of not the reason, but it's sort of like the icing on the cake that finally gets passage of the 19th Amendment in 1919, which is after the war is over, but not by much. And the 19th Amendment, of course, what does that do? That's women's right to vote. So that is where women's right to vote with the 19th Amendment, considered the last of the progressive era amendments. So we know that argument for women's suffrage, that was part of the progressive movement, and progressives had been pushing it, and feminists had been pushing it. A lot of states had already done it. But then after World War I, that kind of seals the deal. Wilson kind of conceding that women had kind of earned it after their work in factories and such during World War I. Now, as well as mobilizing the economy, and we'll talk later about mobilizing the military, another thing that the government undertook was also getting people's opinion on their side, mobilizing public opinion, making sure that people supported the war, that they got the right message, that they got the right understanding. It's interesting that Americans, because of all this, it's almost as if, and maybe this is too strong of a phrase, but almost if they're kind of ordered to support the war. Like, you will support this, and you will see it a certain way. Again, through mainly the same thing we saw with the food and the fuel and all that kind of stuff, through propaganda. And so this organization, this government agency, the Committee on Public Information, is created. And it is led by George Creel. George Creel is like the director or the man in charge of the Committee on Public Information. And their job, is to get the public to support the war, to get information out there, whether it is in pamphlets or in other kinds of entertainment even, to get people to support the war, to get people to see the war as important, to make people patriotic, and to see anything that is against the war, anything that questions the war, anything that doubts the war as unpatriotic. And so it's a massive propaganda campaign. Again, all this was the idea. It's not propaganda. It's not censorship. We don't want to, although they will do some of that. We don't want to tell people that you can't say this and you can't do that, although they kind of do. But we want to put all this propaganda out there to encourage and to sway and to kind of mold and shape people's opinion. So the Committee on Public Information, led by George Krill, it's a lot. They publish pamphlets that they scatter around and send out to churches and to schools and things like that. All kind of posters. There are songs even. The Committee on Public Information employs writers. They employ musicians. They employ actors. They are people that go around giving speeches. That their job, these just naturally charismatic speakers, was to go around to towns, give these quick little speeches to pep people up and get them feeling patriotic and excited, and then move on somewhere else. There are songs even, music. There are movies. This is when movies were just getting off the ground, but there were movies produced to get people to not like Germany, all this kind of with an anti-German sort of spin on it, but all trying to get people to support the war, and ultimately it's quite effective. Now all of this, some of it because the propaganda here was intentionally anti-German, but that plus the fact that the United States was fighting Germany, does lead to a lot of anti-German sentiment, a lot of anti-German feeling throughout the United States. There are certainly plenty of German Americans, whether they were immigrants or had been established as United States citizens for at least a generation, that felt that discrimination in one way or another. There were thousands that were arrested, actually, either for being suspected of some kind of anti-American action or suspected of being spies and things like that. Very, very few, if any, was there ever any evidence to suggest that any of that was true. There were a few, but thousands of people arrested and released by the end of the war. But even not just in targeting people, just the culture itself seemed to have been attacked. There just was an entire kind of movement against anything that even kind of sounded German. I mean, even though it sounds kind of silly, but stuff like sauerkraut, people started calling it liberty cabbage. And any kind of German foods like, I think it's more, like instead of, not hot dogs, but I can't remember now. Oh yeah, like the dog, like a Dachshund, it was a German. Yeah, people started calling like freedom puppies or something weird like that. I can't even quite remember. But just kind of strange things like that. High schools were dropping German as a foreign language that you could take. Anything that's just kind of a hysterical, irrational kind of hatred of anything that was German. No German books, a lot of symphonies were not playing German music, which is quite a lot of classical music and great pieces that were written by German artists. Getting rid of all that stuff and not playing it, seeing that as aiding the enemy and all that sort of stuff. So almost kind of weird in that sense. And lastly, there was a great concern about spies and anything that was seen as subversive. And we must support the war effort and can't say anything bad about it. This leads Congress to actually pass their two separate laws that I've grouped together here because they have pretty much the same purpose. The Espionage and Sedition Acts both passed in 1917. I'll get to that court case in a moment. Espionage, what's espionage? Spying. Sedition, what's sedition? Tricky word. Well, sedition, they might accuse the media of that. What now? Yeah, sedition is like seditious speech is that which is treasonous or could be labeled as treasonous or illegal. And this gets tricky in the United States because of free speech. But basically, the Espionage and Sedition Acts tried to outlaw any kind of disloyalty. Any kind of and some of it seemed very practical and very Okay, you can't aid the enemy and that kind of stuff. But it essentially outlaws anything that was considered disloyal or abusive of the government. Anything that, it kind of amounts to anything that's critical. It could be interpreted that way. And of course, people criticized that it seemed to be like you couldn't disagree. Even just expressing doubt about the United States involvement, is this the best thing for us to be doing, could be considered sedition under these laws. So any acts of, anything to, whether it's refusing service in the military, if you're going around distributing anti-war pamphlets, all those kind of things is possible. You could get arrested under the Espionage and Sedition Acts, and there were a number of people that were. And you can see how that would have been extremely controversial, and questions about whether or not that was legal. What point are you violating people's free speech? That's exactly the basis of this case. This is pronounced Shank versus the United States. This is a landmark court case in the area of free speech and all of that. You'll probably see this again next year in government with your civil liberties and all that kind of stuff. Shank was a guy that was arrested for distributing anti-war leaflets, or like little papers, encouraging, or anti-draft. I think it was specifically about the draft, because they were doing that, encouraging people that was wrong and we shouldn't be doing that, blah, blah, blah. And he gets arrested and convicted, and he argues that that's my right of free speech. I can say that I don't agree. I can say that people ought to be against that policy. And in this case, the Supreme Court actually upheld his conviction and said that the government had the right to limit that kind of speech. If, and this is kind of becomes the litmus test for this kind of stuff from here on, the words the court uses is that they can, it is okay for the government to limit that kind of speech if it poses, quote, a clear and present danger. Some of you may have heard that phrase before, clear and present danger. I think it was in the movie or something. That was the title. Basically, when the court says they can do that, if it presents a clear and present danger. If somebody is saying something that is in, like enticing violence or rebellion or something like that, then the government has the authority to stop that. Of course, then the question becomes, well, is a guy standing on the corner handing out little papers saying, hey, we should oppose the draft, is that a clear and present danger? But that's kind of been the litmus test ever since then about certain types of free speech, about if it poses a clear and present danger. I'm pretty sure this is the case where they give the analogy of, we can't sit up in a crowded theater and yell fire, because that would incite panic, and that would, cause people to get hurt when everybody tries to run out. So that's not protected. So that not all, putting more, definition about what the limitations of free speech are. Okay, so the United States going through a massive effort and seeing the United States government expand its authority in order to prepare itself for the war. Now that also includes the military, so that's what we're looking at next week, is military mobilization. We'll see the United States use the draft, which had also been used during the Civil War, and then we'll talk a little bit about involvement in the war, not too much about the fighting, unfortunately, but a little bit. Some of the big campaigns the United States was involved in, and then of course the end of it. Okay, so questions, any questions at all, anything we need to go back to on that? Okay, hold on just a second.